The fire crackled and hissed as the damp wood struggled to burn. Four friends, Alex, Mia, Sam, and Jenna, sat in a tight circle, their faces glowing orange in the flickering light, surrounded by the dense and oppressive shadows of Black Hollow Forest. The forest was infamous for its chilling reputation. Stories of lost hikers, strange sightings, and eerie sounds were whispered about in the nearby town. But the friends dismissed them as silly tales meant to spook tourists. They had planned this camping trip as an escape from their monotonous routines, but the decision to camp in Black Hollow was Alex's idea. A test of courage, he had insisted. The night was unnaturally still. Even the wind seemed to shy away, leaving the towering trees standing like silent sentinels. Jenna, always the nervous one, fidgeted with her flashlight. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" she whispered, her voice almost drowned by the fire's crackle. "Relax," Alex said, leaning back with forced bravado. "It's just a forest. There's nothing out here but trees and maybe a few deer. You're safer here than crossing the street in town." "Yeah," Sam chimed in. "The only thing to be afraid of is running out of marshmallows." He chuckled, but his laughter was thin, almost hollow. Mia, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes and took a long sip from her flask. "You guys want to scare yourselves? Go ahead, but if I hear one more urban legend about the Whistler or the Faceless Man, I'm walking back to the car tonight." As if summoned by her words, a faint sound pierced the stillness. A low, mournful whistle carried through the trees, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind if the wind had stirred. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the dark wall of the forest. Jenna clutched her flashlight tighter, her knuckles white. "Probably just a bird," Alex said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yeah, a bird," Mia said, but her sarcasm faltered. "Who cares? Let's just get some sleep." They reluctantly agreed and retreated to their tents, though sleep felt impossible. The whistling came again, this time louder, more deliberate, like a melody being played just beyond the firelight. It was haunting, drawing out an instinctual unease that none of them could explain. Alex grabbed a flashlight and unzipped his tent. "I'm checking it out," he announced. "You're insane," Jenna hissed. "Don't go out there." "Relax," Alex said, flashing her a smirk. "It's probably some idiot trying to mess with us." But as he stepped beyond the glow of the fire, the forest seemed to swallow him whole. Minutes passed like hours. The whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then came a scream, short, sharp, and filled with terror. It was Alex. Sam and Mia burst out of their tents, armed with flashlights and a camping knife. Jenna was paralyzed, trembling inside her tent. "Stay here," Mia ordered her, her voice steady but her face pale. She and Sam ventured into the darkness, their flashlights cutting weak paths through the trees. "Alex?" Sam called, his voice wavering. "This isn't funny, man." They found Alex, or what was left of him, lying in a clearing about 50 yards from camp. His face was frozen in a mask of pure horror, his eyes wide and glassy, staring into nothing. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and sticky in the moonlight. Deep gashes scored his chest, as though claws had torn through him. Mia gagged, stumbling back. Sam clutched her arm, his face as pale as Alex's. "What? What did this?" Sam stammered. Before Mia could answer, the whistling returned. It was close, too close, and seemed to echo from every direction. The melody twisted and turned, no longer mournful but mocking, playful in a way that curdled the blood. The pair ran back to camp, their breaths ragged, the forest seemingly alive with the sound of snapping twigs and rustling leaves. When they reached the campfire, Jenna was gone. Her tent was shredded, her belongings scattered. "Jenna!" Mia screamed, but the only response was the whistling, now accompanied by faint guttural laughter. "We have to get out of here," Sam said, grabbing Mia's arm. They sprinted toward the trail that led to their car, their flashlights bobbing wildly. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing denser, their gnarled branches clawing at their clothes and skin. The laughter grew louder, and shadows darted just beyond their vision. Mia tripped, falling hard onto the dirt path. Sam turned to help her, but his face twisted in terror. Behind her, something loomed, a figure impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by the shadows. It reached for Mia with hands that ended in sharp, glinting claws. Sam bolted, his scream echoing through the forest. Mia's cries were cut off abruptly. He ran until his legs burned and his lungs felt ready to burst. When he finally reached the car, he found the driver's side door wide open. Jenna sat in the passenger seat, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her lifeless eyes staring blankly ahead. The whistling returned, now right behind him. The next morning, the local search party found the campsite deserted. 4 sets of footprints led into the forest, but none returned. The only trace of the campers was a small, battered flashlight lying in the dirt, its beam flickering weakly. The air was still, save for the faint sound of a distant, haunting melody.
Story number 2.
The 3 friends, Rachel, Darren, and Marcus, arrived at Lake Widow under the fading light of a late autumn day. The campsite was remote, nestled deep in a wilderness area known for its glassy lake, towering pines, and eerie quiet. Locals often warned visitors against staying overnight. Stories of people vanishing or finding bizarre things carved into trees were common, but the friends dismissed them as exaggerated campfire tales. The first night passed uneventfully, though the quiet unnerved them. It wasn't just quiet. There was an absence of life. No birds chirped, no crickets sang. Even the wind seemed to avoid the area. As they settled into their tents, Rachel thought she heard a faint tapping sound, like knuckles gently rapping against a hard surface. She brushed it off as her imagination. The second night was different. The 3 of them sat around the fire, sharing laughs and stories, when Darren paused mid-sentence, his head cocked toward the trees. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Rachel replied, her voice uneasy. "Shh, listen." For a moment, there was only silence. Then came a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers on a hollow log. Marcus laughed nervously. "Probably a woodpecker." "In the dark?" Darren said, his voice tense. They strained to locate the source of the sound, their flashlights slicing through the thick blackness. Nothing moved. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Darren shrugged, trying to shake off his unease. "Guess it's nothing." Later, as they lay in their tents, the sound returned. Closer this time. The taps had morphed into a soft scratching, like nails dragging against fabric. Rachel sat upright, clutching her flashlight. Her breath hitched when she saw it, long, pale fingers retreating from the edge of her tent flap. "Darren! Marcus!" she screamed, scrambling out of her sleeping bag. The other 2 bolted out of their tents, flashlights in hand. "What's wrong?" Darren shouted. "Something was outside my tent!" Rachel cried, pointing. The others swept their flashlights across the area, revealing only empty woods. The forest seemed to press in on them, the trees standing unnaturally still. "Maybe it was an animal," Marcus offered weakly. "An animal with fingers?" Rachel snapped. Darren nodded toward the fire. "Let's stick together until sunrise. We'll pack up and leave first thing in the morning." The 3 of them huddled around the fire, but its light offered little comfort. The tapping resumed, louder and more insistent, echoing from all directions. Rachel whimpered, and Marcus tightened his grip on a hatchet he'd brought. "Who's there?" Darren shouted into the darkness. The response was a voice, raspy and low, yet undeniably human. "Come closer." They froze. The voice hadn't come from one place, but seemed to echo around them, bouncing off the trees. Darren took a cautious step forward, aiming his flashlight into the woods. The beam landed on a figure standing just beyond the firelight. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its face was obscured by a burlap mask with a crude smile stitched into it. The figure raised a hand and tapped its long, bony fingers against a tree trunk. "Tap! Tap! Tap! Run!" Darren shouted. The 3 bolted, leaving their gear and fire behind. The figure didn't follow, but the tapping continued, growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and the campsite. They reached the trailhead just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Panting and trembling, they piled into Marcus's car, vowing never to speak of what they had seen. But when they arrived back in town, something was wrong. The streets were eerily empty, the stores dark. At Rachel's insistence, they checked their phones. No signal, not even a date or time. When they returned to Marcus's car, its windows were fogged from the inside. On the windshield, written in long, smudged streaks, was a single word, "Stay." The tapping began again, this time from inside the car.
Story number 3.
The bus rumbled down the lonely mountain road, its headlights barely piercing the thick veil of fog that clung to the ground. There were only 5 passengers. Ella, her younger brother Jake, an elderly man with a crumpled hat, a quiet woman staring out the window, and a man in a faded suit who had been clutching a briefcase as if it held his soul. The driver, a grizzled man with hollow eyes, hadn't said much since they left the last town hours ago. Ella glanced at her watch. It had stopped ticking. The dim red numbers on the digital clock above the driver's seat blinked erratically. Midnight had come and gone, and the fog seemed to thicken with every mile. Jake, restless and wide-eyed, leaned toward her. "Do you think we're lost?" Ella ruffled his hair. "It's just the fog. Once we're out of it, we'll be fine." But her voice wavered. The road stretched endlessly ahead with no signs or intersections, just darkness. The bus jerked to a sudden stop, throwing everyone forward in their seats. The driver muttered a curse under his breath, gripping the wheel tightly. "What's wrong?" the man in the suit asked, his voice sharp. "Something in the road," the driver replied. Ella peered through the windshield but saw only swirling mist. Then slowly a figure emerged. It was a woman, standing in the middle of the road. She was barefoot, her white dress tattered and wet, her long black hair clinging to her pale face. She stood perfectly still, arms hanging limply at her sides. "Should we help her?" Ella asked uncertainly. "She doesn't look hurt," Jake whispered, sinking lower in his seat. "She looks wrong." The driver shook his head. "No one gets off this bus. Got it?" His voice was firm, almost desperate. He shifted the bus into reverse, but the gears ground loudly, refusing to engage. He cursed again, slamming the stick forward. The bus lurched, but the woman didn't move. She was closer now, though no one had seen her step forward. Her dark eyes locked onto Ella's, unblinking. "Drive around her," the elderly man suggested. "Not that simple," the driver muttered. Ella looked back at the passengers. Everyone was tense, their faces pale. The man in the suit began fiddling nervously with his briefcase. The woman by the window turned away, pressing her hands over her ears. "Why isn't she moving?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. The woman raised her hand. Slowly, deliberately, she pointed at the bus. Then she smiled, wide, too wide, and the mist around her seemed to ripple and twist as if alive. The lights on the bus flickered. "Shut the curtains," the driver barked. "Don't look at her." Ella yanked the curtains shut, her heart pounding. The lights continued to flicker, and a low hum filled the air like static from an old TV. Jake grabbed her hand, his grip tight. "I don't like this, Ella," he whimpered. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the floor of the bus. The driver tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. The headlights blinked once, twice, and went out completely. Darkness swallowed them. Then came the knock. It was light at first, tapping against the bus's door. Tap, tap, tap. Everyone froze, their breaths shallow. The tapping turned into pounding, louder and faster, rattling the door in its frame. "She wants to come in," the quiet woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't let her in." The elderly man muttered a prayer under his breath, clutching a rosary he'd pulled from his pocket. The man in the suit stood as if drawn toward the door, but the driver shouted, "Sit down! Don't you dare open it!" The pounding stopped. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Then from the back of the bus came another sound. A soft giggle, high-pitched and chilling. Jake screamed, pointing toward the aisle. The woman was inside. She stood at the back, her head tilted unnaturally to the side, her smile frozen. The passengers scrambled toward the front, but the bus felt impossibly long now, the distance between them and the door stretching. The woman took a step forward, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the floor. "She's not real," Ella shouted, though she didn't believe it. "Stay away from her." The woman moved closer, her smile growing impossibly wide. Her eyes were pools of black, empty and endless. The quiet woman began sobbing, burying her face in her hands. The man in the suit dropped his briefcase and collapsed to his knees. Jake clung to Ella, his face buried in her shoulder. "Don't let her get me, Ella. Please." Ella turned toward the driver, but he was gone. The seat was empty, the steering wheel spinning on its own. The bus started to move, the engine roaring to life, but the headlights revealed only endless fog. The passengers screamed as the bus hurtled forward, the woman's laughter echoing around them. Ella's vision blurred, her grip on Jake slipping. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the woman's face, inches from hers, whispering in a voice that was not a voice. "You'll never leave." When Ella woke, the bus was empty. It sat in the middle of a cracked and overgrown road, surrounded by towering trees. The fog was gone, but so were the other passengers, and Jake. She stumbled outside, screaming his name, but her voice was swallowed by the vast and silent forest. The bus door hissed shut behind her. When she turned, it was gone, leaving only deep tire tracks that vanished into the dirt. From somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of laughter. Then,
Story number 4.
it started as a dare. 6 friends, Emma, Ben, Laura, Chris, Zoe, and Tyler, stood at the rusted gates of Grayson Asylum. a long-abandoned psychiatric hospital buried deep in the woods. Legend had it that patients and staff had disappeared one stormy night decades ago, leaving behind only empty halls and unanswered questions. Locals claimed the building was cursed, that screams still echoed through its walls on quiet nights. "Bet you won't last an hour," Tyler taunted, his flashlight beam cutting through the damp night air. Emma rolled her eyes, but her grip on the flashlight tightened. "You're on," she said, stepping through the broken gate. The others followed reluctantly, their playful banter fading as the hulking silhouette of the asylum loomed before them. The building was a crumbling nightmare of peeling paint, shattered windows, and vines that twisted like skeletal fingers around its frame. The air grew colder as they entered, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty foyer. Dust motes floated in the beam of their flashlights, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. "Creepy, but not scary," Zoe said, her voice faltering. She held her phone up, recording for what she promised would be viral content. "Let's split up," Ben suggested. "Cover more ground." "Have you seen a horror movie?" Chris retorted, shaking his head, but Tyler had already started down a side corridor, waving them off. "Cowards," he called over his shoulder. "Let me know when you find Casper." Reluctantly, the group split into pairs. Emma and Ben took the west wing, Laura and Chris the east, leaving Zoe to chase after Tyler. The asylum seemed to breathe with its own malevolence. Doors creaked in unseen breezes, faint whispers teased the edges of hearing, and every shadow felt too dark, too alive. Emma and Ben found themselves in what had once been a patient dormitory. Rusted bed frames were scattered haphazardly, and faded graffiti covered the walls. "Look at this," Ben whispered, pointing to a crudely painted message. "Help us." Below it, smaller writing in jagged letters read, "They come when you're alone." "That's comforting," Emma muttered, shivering. They turned to leave, but the doorway they had entered through was gone. The wall was solid, as if it had always been that way. Emma's flashlight flickered, and a guttural laugh echoed faintly from somewhere behind them. "Run," Ben said, grabbing her arm. Meanwhile, Laura and Chris were exploring what appeared to be the staff quarters. The rooms were eerily preserved, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Personal belongings still strewn across desks, overturned chairs, and abandoned cups that had long since turned to mold. Chris opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of yellowed photographs. "These look like staff photos," he said, flipping through them. His breath hitched when he reached the last one. "What is it?" Laura asked, peering over his shoulder. The photo showed their group standing at the asylum gate, taken from the inside. Who took this?" Laura stammered, backing away. A loud bang echoed through the hall, and the lights in their flashlights died. In the pitch black, Laura grabbed Chris's arm. "We have to find the others." But Chris didn't respond. When she tugged, his hand slipped from hers. It was cold, unnaturally so. "Chris?" she whispered, but the only sound was her own breathing. Zoe had caught up to Tyler in the basement, where the air was damp and oppressive. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling, and ancient medical equipment lay in eerie disarray. "This is a bad idea," Zoe said, glancing around nervously. Tyler smirked, pulling out his phone to take a video. "It's just an old building. Chill." But when he turned the camera toward Zoe, she wasn't there. "Zoe?" he called, spinning around. The flashlight revealed only empty space. "Funny. Real funny," he muttered, his voice shaking. The sound of dripping water grew louder, though there was none in sight. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and circling him. Tyler swung his flashlight wildly, but it only illuminated empty corners and shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. When the beam landed on Zoe, he let out a breath of relief until he noticed her face. Her eyes were too wide, her mouth stretched in an unnatural grin. She raised her hand and pointed behind him. Tyler turned slowly. The flashlight flickered, revealing a hulking figure draped in shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, and it exhaled a rattling breath that carried the stench of decay. The group never made it out of the asylum. The next morning, the sheriff received an anonymous call about screams heard near Grayson Asylum. When officers arrived, they found no sign of the friends. The only clue was a phone lying on the front steps, its screen cracked. The video on the phone was corrupted, save for a single frame. It showed a group of 6 young people standing in the foyer of the asylum, but their faces were wrong, blurred, stretched, and twisted into expressions of unspeakable terror. And in the background, just barely visible, a figure watched from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on the camera.
Story number 5.
The sun had barely set when the group of 4, Matt, Lisa, Rachel, and Tom, pulled up to the gravel clearing at the edge of Blackwater Swamp. They were urban explorers, always looking for places untouched by modernity, and Blackwater was rumored to be one of the most haunted wetlands in the state. Stories of disappearing hunters, strange lights, and ghostly figures moving through the thick fog had made it a local legend. "This place is unreal," Matt said, stepping out of the car and taking a deep breath of the damp, mossy air. The swamp stretched out before them, endless and ominous. Thick cypress trees rose from the water, their roots twisted and exposed like skeletal hands grasping for the surface. A low mist curled around the base of the trees, giving the landscape an ethereal glow. Lisa checked her camera, making sure it was ready. "All right, let's get some footage before it gets too dark. Tom, bring the gear." Tom slung the backpack over his shoulder, muttering something about how they should have waited until morning. Rachel, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes. "It's just a swamp, guys. Creepy, sure, but not haunted. Let's get this over with." They moved deeper into the swamp, following a narrow wooden boardwalk that creaked under their weight. The air grew cooler, heavier, and the mist thickened, dampening the light from their flashlights. Insects buzzed around their heads but even their droning seemed subdued, as if the swamp itself demanded silence. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered, stopping suddenly. The group paused, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the distant sound of frogs and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then it came, a faint, wet squelching, like footsteps in the mud. It was distant but deliberate, the sound of someone or something moving through the swamp. "It's probably an animal," Rachel said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Let's just keep moving," Matt urged, taking the lead. "We'll make it to the old cabin, shoot some footage, and head back. Easy." The cabin was their destination, a crumbling relic from when trappers and fishermen used to live in the swamp. As they pressed on, the boardwalk became more unstable, and the mist grew so thick they could barely see a few feet ahead. When the cabin finally came into view, it was almost a relief, until they got closer. The small wooden structure leaned precariously to one side, its roof sagging. The windows were dark, gaping holes, and the door hung ajar, swaying slightly in a breeze none of them could feel. "All right," Lisa said, raising her camera. "Let's get some exterior shots." As she filmed, Matt pushed the door open, revealing a single room filled with rotting furniture and the remnants of a life long abandoned. A moldy mattress lay in the corner, and a rusted pot sat on a broken wood-burning stove. Scratches marred the walls, long and deep like claw marks. "Creepy," Tom muttered, setting the gear down. "Perfect for the video," Lisa said, focusing her camera on the scratches. Suddenly, Rachel gasped, pointing to a far corner of the room. "What's that?" The group turned to see a pile of damp, yellowed papers stacked neatly on the floor. Matt approached cautiously, picking one up. It was a photograph, faded and warped from moisture. It showed a group of people smiling at the camera, except their faces were blurred, smeared as if someone had rubbed them out. "I don't like this," Rachel said, stepping back toward the door. Matt rifled through the papers, finding more photos, all with the same eerie distortion. Beneath them, he uncovered a notebook. The cover was soft and bloated from water damage, but the pages inside were legible. Scrawled in messy handwriting were the words, "They're watching. Don't look. Don't let them see you." "What the hell does that mean?" Lisa asked, peering over his shoulder. Before Matt could answer, a loud splash echoed outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the water. "An alligator?" Tom suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe," Rachel said, her voice tight. "But it's getting closer." The group huddled by the window and averred, peering into the mist. At first, they saw nothing. Then, faintly, shapes began to emerge, figures moving through the fog. They were tall and thin, their limbs unnaturally long, their movements jerky, as if they were puppets on invisible strings. "They're coming toward us," Lisa whispered, clutching her camera. "Get back!" Matt hissed, pulling her away from the window. The group scrambled to the middle of the room, their flashlights darting around as the scratching noise began again, this time from the walls. "They're here," Rachel said, her voice breaking. The door creaked open, though no one was there. The mist poured in, swirling around their feet. One by one, their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The last thing Matt saw before the light failed completely was a face, impossibly close, pale and expressionless, with empty black pits where the eyes should have been. The next morning, the sheriff found the group's car abandoned at the edge of the swamp. Inside the vehicle were their phones, wallets, and a single camera. The footage showed the four walking into the swamp, laughing and joking, but the recording abruptly ended with the sound of splashing water and a faint, rasping whisper. "They're watching."
Story number 6.
The wind howled through the dense forest as Carla, James, Mia, and Ethan trudged up the uneven path. The trees around them swayed ominously, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal hands against the darkening sky. They were miles from civilization, hiking to find the infamous Wailing Cliffs, a secluded spot with an eerie reputation. According to legend, the cliffs were haunted by the spirits of those who had leapt to their deaths. Locals claimed you could hear their wails on the wind, calling to anyone who ventured too close. Carla, ever the thrill-seeker, had insisted on the trip. "It's just a story," she'd said when Ethan expressed his doubts. "We'll see some great views, snap some pictures, and head back." The sun dipped below the horizon as they reached the top of the cliffs. The rocky outcrop jutted out over an expanse of blackness, the ground below hidden in shadow. The air felt heavier up there, almost oppressive, and the temperature had dropped sharply. "Pretty spooky," James muttered, peering over the edge. The drop was sheer, a deadly plunge into the unseen below. "Let's set up camp," Mia suggested, glancing nervously at the encroaching darkness. They pitched their tents a few yards from the edge and built a small fire. It crackled weakly, casting flickering shadows that danced among the trees. As they ate, a high-pitched sound broke the silence, rising and falling like a mournful cry. Everyone froze, staring at each other. "What was that?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just the wind," Carla said, though she didn't sound convinced. The wail came again, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. It sounded human, desperate, and filled with anguish. Ethan stood, scanning the area with his flashlight. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and jagged rocks. "We should leave," Mia said, gripping Ethan's arm. "This doesn't feel right." Carla rolled her eyes. "It's just a prank or something. Someone trying to scare hikers." James looked uneasy. "How would anyone even know we're here?" The group fell silent, the fire crackling weakly between them. Then, from the direction of the cliffs, came another sound. Laughter, low, guttural, and chilling. "That's not funny, Carla," Mia snapped, assuming it was a joke. Carla shook her head, her face pale. "That wasn't me." The laughter grew louder, the half coming from multiple voices now. It was uneven, overlapping, and filled with an unnatural glee that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Ethan shone his flashlight toward the cliffs, and for a moment they saw them. Figures standing on the edge. There were at least 6 of them, silhouettes against the starless sky. Their shapes were wrong, too tall, their limbs bending at impossible angles. "Who's there?" Ethan shouted, but the figures didn't respond. Instead, they moved closer, stepping off the edge and floating toward the group. "Run!" Carla screamed, scrambling to her feet. They bolted into the forest, their flashlights bouncing wildly. The laughter followed them, growing louder, echoing in their ears. It seemed to come from all directions, making it impossible to tell where the pursuers were. Mia tripped on a root and fell hard. Ethan stopped to help her, but she grabbed his arm, her face frozen in terror. "Behind you," she choked out. He turned slowly. One of the figures was there, inches away, its face a blank, featureless void. It reached for him with elongated fingers that seemed to stretch and twist like shadows. He yanked Mia to her feet, and they ran deeper into the forest. They found Carla and James huddled near a massive tree, their flashlights dead. "Where's the fire?" Carla whispered, her voice trembling. "Gone," James said. "We couldn't find it. It's like we've been running in circles." The laughter ceased, plunging the forest into a deafening silence. Then came the whispers. "Jump! Join us! It's so easy!" The voices slithered into their ears, soft but insistent. The friends pressed their hands over their ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside, they were inside their heads. "We have to keep moving," Ethan said, his voice cracking. But no matter which way they turned, the landscape stayed the same. Trees, rocks, and endless darkness. Mia pointed toward the cliffs. "Look!" The figures were there again, standing motionless on the edge, their blank faces turned toward the group. One by one, they stepped forward, plunging off the cliff, but instead of falling, they floated upward, their bodies twisting unnaturally as they hovered closer. The friends backed away, their steps faltering. One of the figures reached out a spindly hand and touched Carla's shoulder. She screamed, and her body convulsed violently before crumpling to the ground. "Carla!" James shouted, shaking her. Her eyes snapped open, but they weren't her eyes anymore. They were dark, empty voids, and her lips curled into a grotesque smile. "Jump," she whispered. James staggered back, and Carla stood, her movements jerky and puppet-like. "Jump," she said again, her voice layered with the others. "You'll be free." The figures surged forward, their laughter rising once more. The group scattered, running blindly into the forest. Ethan turned back just in time to see Carla step off the cliff, her body floating upward to join the others. By dawn, only Mia made it back to civilization. Her hair was streaked with white, her eyes hollow, and her words incoherent. Weeks later, a search party found no trace of the others, only a single flashlight lying near the cliff's edge. On the rock beside it was a message scratched into the stone, jagged and desperate. "Don't listen to them."
Story number 7.
The narrow road twisted endlessly through the dense forest, the canopy above swallowing the faint light of the moon. Kate, Mark, Olivia, and Jason were on their way to a remote cabin they had rented for a weekend getaway. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, leaving them to rely on printed directions that seemed increasingly unreliable. "This is how horror movies start," Jason muttered from the back seat, peering out at the endless rows of trees. "Oh, come on," Kate replied, trying to sound cheerful. "It's just a little off the beaten path. That's what makes it an adventure." The cabin finally came into view, its silhouette barely visible through the fog that clung to the forest floor. It was smaller than expected, with peeling paint and broken shutters, but it stood alone in a clearing, surrounded by nothing but wilderness. "This is it?" Olivia asked, her unease evident. "Yup," Mark said, killing the engine. "Rustic charm. Let's go." The group unloaded their gear and entered the cabin. The interior was cold, musty, and dimly lit by a single bulb that buzzed faintly overhead. The furniture was old and mismatched, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface. Jason glanced at a faded painting on the wall, a family portrait of 3, a man, a woman, and a young girl, their faces worn and smeared with time. "Creepy," he said, tilting his head to get a better look. "Just ignore it," Kate said, setting down a cooler. "Let's make the best of it." The first night passed uneventfully, though none of them slept well. The forest was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional rustling outside, which they all dismissed as animals. The second day, they decided to explore. The forest seemed endless, the trees growing taller and closer together the deeper they ventured. They found no trails, no wildlife, and no landmarks, only an oppressive silence and a sense that they were being watched. "Weird that we haven't seen a single bird or squirrel," Olivia said, glancing nervously around. Mark shrugged. "It's a dense forest. They're probably just keeping their distance." That evening, as they sat around the fireplace, the wind began to howl. It rattled the cabin's windows and seemed to carry faint whispers, though none of them mentioned it. They tried to distract themselves with games and stories, but the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour. Just before midnight, Jason excused himself to grab his phone charger from the car. He stepped out into the cold night and disappeared into the fog. Minutes passed. Then 10, then 20. "Where is he?" Olivia asked, pacing nervously. "I'll go check," Mark said, grabbing a flashlight. "He probably got distracted." Mark returned minutes later, pale and shaken. "The car's gone," he said. "Jason's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" Kate asked, her voice rising. "I mean, he's not there, and the car's not there," Mark snapped. As panic set in, a loud knock echoed from the cabin door. They froze, staring at one another. "Jason?" Kate called out hesitantly, moving toward the door. "Don't," Olivia whispered, grabbing her arm. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scratching sound. Kate opened the door, just a crack. Nobody was there. The scratching intensified, moving to the windows. The group huddled together, staring as long, pale fingers began to slide across the glass, leaving streaks of condensation behind. The whispers returned, louder now, insistent and unintelligible. "Shut the curtains!" Mark shouted, and they rushed to block out the windows. The scratching moved to the walls, then the roof, surrounding them. Suddenly, the single light bulb flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. "Stay together," Kate whispered, her voice trembling. A low, guttural growl rumbled from somewhere inside the cabin. Olivia screamed, and Mark shone his flashlight toward the sound. The The beam illuminated a figure crouched in the corner. Jason. Jason? Kate asked, relief flooding her voice. But something was wrong. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide and empty. And he opened his mouth to speak, but the words that came out were garbled and distorted, like a recording played backward. "Run," Olivia whimpered, backing away. Jason lunged forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. The flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, he was gone. "Get out!" Mark yelled, fumbling with the door. They spilled into the night, the fog swallowing them instantly. The whispers were everywhere now, louder and more chaotic, like dozens of voices speaking at once. They ran blindly, the forest closing in around them. The trees seemed to shift, blocking their path no matter which way they turned. Olivia tripped and screamed, clutching at her leg. Mark and Kate stopped to help her, but she was staring in horror at the ground. Jason's face stared back at them, half buried in the dirt, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. "What is this?" Mark gasped, pulling Kate to her feet. They dragged Olivia with them, their breaths ragged as the whispers grew deafening. The cabin came back into view, though they were certain they had been running away from it. The door stood open, light spilling out and casting long, unnatural shadows. "We have to go back," Kate said, her voice desperate. "Are you insane?" Mark yelled. "We're not going in there." But the choice was made for them. The figures emerged from the fog, tall, thin, and featureless, their bodies twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. They fled inside and slammed the door shut, but it was too late. The whispers filled the cabin, the light bulb exploding in a shower of sparks. The last thing Kate saw before the darkness consumed them was the family portrait on the wall. It had changed. The faces were clearer now, and they were smiling. By the time the search party arrived 3 days later, the cabin was empty. The only clue was the painting on the wall, which now included 4 new faces, each frozen in an expression of pure terror.
Story number 8.
The van's engine sputtered as Claire, Jake, Sophia, and Ben drove deeper into the backcountry. The dirt road they'd been following had long since disappeared into overgrown grass, and the GPS showed nothing but a blank expanse. They were supposed to be heading to Blue Hollow, a camping spot they'd heard about through a friend of a friend, but now they weren't even sure they were going the right way. "It's fine," Jake said from the driver's seat, though his grip on the wheel was tight. "We'll set up camp here for the night and figure it out in the morning." The group piled out into the fading light, the forest around them eerily quiet. The air felt strange, thick and heavy, as if pressing against their skin. A faint scent of decay wafted through the air, but they couldn't find its source. "This place is giving me bad vibes," Sophia muttered, hugging her arms to her chest. "Relax," Claire said, forcing a smile. "It's just the wilderness. Let's get the tent up before it gets dark." They worked quickly, setting up camp under a cluster of towering pines. As night fell, the silence grew deafening. There were no crickets, no owls, just the occasional creak of branches swaying in a breeze none of them could feel. The fire crackled weakly, its light barely reaching the edges of their clearing. They sat in uneasy silence until Ben broke it with a laugh. "We're just psyching ourselves out," he said. "Come on, let's tell some ghost stories. Get into the spirit of things." Jake smirked. "Fine, but I'm not sharing marshmallows with anyone who cries." As they traded tales, the forest seemed to close in around them. Shadows danced on the edge of the firelight, and Sophia kept glancing over her shoulder. "Okay," she said finally, standing. "I'm done. I'm going to the van." "Don't leave us with your creepy vibes," Jake teased, but Sophia ignored him, disappearing into the dark. Minutes passed, then an hour. The fire burned lower, and Claire glanced at the van, its outline barely visible in the distance. "She's been gone a while." "She probably fell asleep," Ben said, poking the fire. "I'll go check." He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the van. The others waited, their unease growing with each passing second. When Ben didn't return, Claire stood, brushing off her jeans. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice tight. "I'll go with you," Jake offered, Definals grabbing his flashlight. They approached the van together, its windows fogged up from the inside. Claire knocked on the door. "Sophia? Ben, are you in there?" No answer. Jake tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he said, shining his flashlight inside. The beam cut through the fog, revealing nothing but empty seats. "They're not here," Claire whispered. Before they could turn back, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't human. It was guttural, low, and rhythmic, like a heavy breathing or a growl. It came from the woods behind them. "Run," Jake hissed. They sprinted back to the campfire, their hearts pounding. But the clearing was empty, their tent torn, the fire reduced to smoldering embers. Of Ben and Sophia there was no sign. Where are they? Claire gasped, her chest heaving. Jake scanned the forest with his flashlight. The beam flickered, then went out entirely. He slapped it against his hand, cursing under his breath. Then they saw it. A figure stood just beyond the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs were too long, its joints bent backward. Its face was obscured in shadow, but its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting what little light remained. "Claire," Jake said, his voice barely audible. The figure took a step closer, its movements jerky, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Then another step, and another. Jake grabbed Claire's arm, pulling her into the forest. They ran blindly, like branches tearing at their clothes and skin. The sound of heavy, uneven footsteps followed, closer and closer. They stumbled into a dry creek bed and ducked behind a fallen log, struggling to catch their breath. The footsteps slowed, stopping just above them. The figure loomed, its distorted form silhouetted against the pale moonlight. Then it spoke, its voice low and guttural, layered with an unnatural echo. "Why did you come here?" Claire clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Jake's eyes were wide, his body frozen. The figure tilted its head as if listening. Then it crouched, impossibly low, its elongated limbs reaching down toward the log. A scream erupted from somewhere deeper in the forest, a high, piercing sound that seemed to echo forever. The figure jerked upright, its glowing eyes snapping in the direction of the scream. Without a sound, it disappeared into the darkness. Claire and Jake didn't wait to see what it was after. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing at the edge of a gravel road. A passing truck stopped, and the driver called for help. When search parties arrived the next day, the camp was gone. The clearing was empty, with no sign of the torn tent or the fire pit. The van was found miles away, its doors wide open and its interior covered in long, claw-like scratches. Sophia and Ben were never found. Claire and Jake never spoke of that night again. But years later, Claire would still wake to the sound of footsteps outside her window, followed by a voice, faint and distant. "Why did you come here?"